Welcome to Choosing Leadership, a podcast for leaders who refuse to play small. I am Sumit Gupta, founder of Tengen Partners. I am here because I see too many brilliant leaders trapped in daily firefights. Too many companies hitting walls that they do not need to hit. Too many people waiting for weekends instead of waking up every day excited to go to work. And very frankly, that is unacceptable to me. At Tengen Partners, we are an unapologetic call to excellence. This podcast is not about giving you more content. It is about shifting the context under which you operate. Because leadership is not a position, leadership is a choice. In each episode, I will bring you conversations with leaders who have made these choices, the uncomfortable ones, the courageous ones, and the ones that changed everything for them and their companies. And with that, keep listening and let's get started. Hi, James. Welcome to the Choosing Leadership podcast.
Hey, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Before we jump in, why don't you share a little bit about what you do for listeners? And also from your journey, how did you end up here?
Sure. Would you like me to focus more on work, on personal? Where do you want me to go with this in terms of your
I,
listeners? What do you think they'd like to hear most
I
about?
would love to focus on you and especially how do the dots connect in your career, in your life, where you would say, this is where I am today. So what are some of those pivotal moments that you would say that shaped you, your decisions, your work, everything?
So I've always been very interested in people and other people and how they think and how they tend to make decisions about what to do within their lives. I think a lot of that comes from when I was growing up. I'm the youngest of a big family, and there was lots of experiences there of having to try and quite quickly get my head around what everyone was saying around the dinner table, how that kind of impacted my life, how that impacted their lives. And I think that gave me this kind of fascination and curiosity for people more than anything. And then as I developed in terms of my career and the type of things which I've ended up working on, a lot of it is around areas around kind of research, psychology. I studied history at university, and obviously there's a lot there where you look back and get a sense of how people have moved through periods of time, what decisions they've made, the consequences of those decisions, etc. So I think that was a big driver for a lot of the stuff that I'm involved in and interested in today. I think as it relates to leadership, I think there's a few different things as well which have prompted, I suppose, my development along the road. I think predominantly that would be an experience that I had after university. I was selected to go on this kind of leadership development course, basically, that was being run by the British Exploring Society here in the UK. And it was a case of post-university, bringing people out into the mountains, getting them exposed to, we went to Morocco to a mountain called Mount Toubkal there. And it was getting people exposed to working together in teams and building leadership in extreme environments. And that was really formative for me in terms of the type of leader I wanted to be, how I thought that would impact my day to day, etc. And it's informed some of the stuff that I do now as well. So that's a little bit of a roundabout journey, but I think those are probably some of the main, key reasons and key touch points for me that have got me to where I am today.
Yeah. And just for our listeners, you are the CEO of Polar Insights, but you are also a mountaineer, right? That's also something you do quite actively. And we'll touch upon that. But let's go back to what you shared when you were growing up in a large family and being the youngest. What did you learn from that you would say has become your superpower? And what was difficult in that situation that you had to learn or overcome to make yourself heard or seen, and how that relates to what you do today?
So I'll start with the first thing. I think in terms of superpower that's provided or something that's helped to build in me, I think it's similar to what I mentioned earlier around this kind of idea of observation, really, and being able to stand back and observe what's going on in a setting, particularly with people, and almost the ability to spend enough time doing that before I dive in to then make sure that when I am diving in, I'm conscious of the social and the kind of the social interactions which are going on at that particular moment. So to go a bit further than that, I think from the point of view of confidence as it relates to these types of things and jumping into situations that are more complex or you've never been in before. Obviously, a big part of confidence is built up through just doing that repeatedly and making mistakes. And it's a bit like with humor or telling jokes, these types of things. It's like to be able to build that muscle and to be able to feel confident enough to time a joke well, let's say, you have to make quite a lot of bad jokes repeatedly in those environments for you to be able to develop that skill. And I think if you're operating certainly within a family where there's so many different people with so many different points of view and there's such complexity there, I think it provides this really ripe training ground essentially for you to be able to just be perceptive of people and how they might be feeling at any one time. In terms of things that I think other, I suppose, impacts that it would have or things that it might do, it's very hard for me to know. I think a lot of these things are your family shapes you in the positive ways, in more constructive ways. And I think the difficulty is any area of your upbringing or childhood that you remove, it means that you're not necessarily the person you are today. And if you're happy with the person you are today, then you wouldn't want to remove any of those things because it's the diversity of all of those experiences that creates who you are. So I would say I feel like I grew up in a very kind of loving atmosphere. I feel like I was supported to go and do the things that I wanted to do. There was an atmosphere of you can do anything you put your mind to, which I think is such an important thing for children to hear, just from the point of view of like possibilities in front of them in terms of who knows, maybe that's where kind of part of my like exploration mindset comes from, is just this idea of it's okay to think about things on a grand scale, or it's okay to zone in on something which might seem fairly far away or hard to achieve or hard to attain, because it's okay to think about that, right? You have to imagine everything first, and then you put in place the steps to get there. So yeah, I'd say that's kind of some things which I learned, some things which have developed over time, but I've certainly always felt like those things I'm able to go and pursue things. And that isn't to say that it will be easy to pursue those things. Everything comes with hard work to pursue them. So I think it's quite a realistic way of looking at it. But at the same time, to have the exposure to, or the awareness of, this is possible. This is not out of reach. Everyone who has done these things, achieved these things, are human beings with all of the things that means on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. And in a way, your work is also derived from that, right? You are helping companies discover what is missing, right? To help them make better decisions, confident decisions, right? What I want to ask you is, like, for you today, what is it that probably you are not seeing, right? That probably is a gap in your observation or in your knowledge. And then who or how do you fill that gap?
So I think it's a very hard thing with blind spots, obviously, to know what your blind spots are, because if you were aware of them, then they wouldn't necessarily be your blind spots. I think there's a great tool called the Johari's window. You've come across that before.
Yeah.
But it's this interesting idea of kind of some of the unknown unknowns within your experience. And there'll be other things where you have some visibility of them yourself, but other people don't have a visibility of them, or things where other people can see them about you, but you can't see them. And then I believe the kind of the fourth quadrant of this window, which is like this, is basically the stuff which you don't know about yourself, and also other people don't know about you yet. And there's lots of things which obviously develop in your life over time and fulfill that area. I've probably massively mischaracterized the Johari's window. Someone watching this will probably have a better explanation of it, but I think about it in those terms, in that part of probably what drives a lot of the work that I'm doing as well, in terms of understanding environments, understanding people's stakeholders, etc. A lot of that is, how do you discover the things which you don't yet know, which have a big impact on what you might do next, right? So when we're talking about complex decision making, and we're talking about the impact of some of these decisions, part of the risk you're trying to manage there, and part of the opportunity you're trying to cultivate, is really getting a sense of, in a very complex system, if you make a change over here, it's not always necessarily very easy to understand or very linear to understand what might happen next. You have to go through quite a lot of different scenarios. You have to think about what are the things where almost what are the obvious consequences of this decision? And then what are all of the unobvious consequences? And if we're out of ideas about what those should be, who else can we involve in the process to give us a much clearer view of what those things can be? Because to go to what we were speaking earlier about understanding people's perspectives, everyone's perspective is completely different, and everyone's going to bring a whole host of different experiences to that situation, and just be able to bring a level of instinct to it that someone else who's looking at that decision or looking at that context won't be able to. So
Yeah. And one of the ways to do that is to actually put yourself in new situations, or doing something like for you, like the very mountaineering teaches you about yourself, which probably you can't learn from a boardroom, for a meeting, from doing regular corporate work that you do, right? So can you share a bit about the mountaineering side of you, right? First of all, what does that give you? Like, what do you get out of that? And what is the cost? Because you are a CEO, you're running a company. A lot of people would say, I have no time for anything like that. And you're taking on the 7 Summits challenge, right? Which is not just mountaineering, but something huge, right? So what do you get out of that? And what does it cost you?
So I think the way that I consider this, and I think the right way to consider it really is, for me, it's about providing me with the perspective and kind of mental and psychological plasticity to be able to make the right decisions for my business and the right decisions for our customers. So for me, it's about serving as not only there's obviously like kind of a physical side to it and a psychological side to it, from the point of view of just getting outdoors, doing exercise, pushing your body in different ways to be able to complete the physical side of it. But I think there's the perspective that you get from going out into the mountains, going out into the outdoors. It doesn't need to be that you're going on a huge mountain. It can be getting outdoors, going walking in your local area, just getting out into nature in general, that brings you a level of clarity and perspective on your day to day, that if you think about from the point of view of what the role of a CEO is and what the role of a business owner is, that's really about making good decisions about the future, often with imperfect information. So one of the ways to make that as successful as possible and as optimal as possible is that you want to make sure that you're making those decisions in the right frame of mind, and that you're not doing them under stress, and there's nothing that's basically impacting your perspective. So I think about it really as almost like an investment in my work. If I can do these things, I'm able to take time away from work to get both rest, but also a different perspective, but also pull into my day-to-day work and my day-to-day decisions all of the skills that being out in nature give you, and like a big part of why I've set out to do this challenge is about the fact that it's a hard challenge. It's something which seems impossible at the beginning. And then as you do each stage of it and as you progress through it, it becomes easier and easier because you pick up the skills required to do the next step. I think there's a real similarity between challenges like this and building a business, in that the people who end up building businesses or kind of building movements, campaigns, whatever that might be, it's the fact that they concentrate on what needs to happen next to get me to that big goal in the future. Because actually you don't go from doing nothing to climbing Everest, let's say. There's so many different steps involved between those two things. But to give you the motivation to get started and to be able to have something that will pull you along that journey, you obviously need that like big end goal. Because you also need to make lots of decisions as you move towards it, right? So you need a criteria of some variety. And that might just be, is this going to get me closer to my end goal? To allow you to say, okay, I'm going to do that, and I'm not going to do this. I'm going to choose that path. I'm not going to choose this path. And so I would say that's how some of these things start to weave together. But for me, I see it as a real investment in myself and in the business. The more I can build up that resilience and build up that strength and build up those kind of leadership qualities we were
Exactly.
talking about previously, that's only going to be to the advantage of my customers, my team, anyone that I'm working with.
Yeah. And is there an equivalent of that kind of a vision or a big goal for your business?
One of our kind of key areas that we would love to move towards as an organization is we believe that stakeholder proximity, and this idea of, we think about one of the biggest problems within large organizations specifically is that over time, all of their stakeholders, if you imagine them as a bit of a network, that network tends to diverge and people tend to drift away over time. And we see that the best businesses out there and the highest performing businesses are those that keep their stakeholders really close through building systems to do that over time. So that's the type of thing we help our customers with. What we would love to see in the future is stakeholder proximity being a completely integrated part of decision making within the boards of the largest businesses in the world. We think that every big decision, whether that's a big strategic decision, an operational decision, whatever it is that you might be making, we see that unless you're really taking into account what all of the stakeholders around that situation are thinking, feeling, how they're going to react, what they might do as a result of that decision, if that's being neglected, then that's going to have a compounding negative effect over time. And we see that where stakeholder proximity can be embedded in boards, whether that's in the private sector or in the public sector, that feels like the level of impact that we want to have, feels how we want to build and scale and grow what we do.
Yeah.
I think there's a real appetite for that.
Yeah. You also spoke about, and you just were talking about confidence and making.
Mm.
One thing which I have seen from my work is a lot of indecision in companies, right? And especially when you are on a mountain, I think you know that you are on your own. But many times in business, everybody is waiting for somebody to speak first or somebody to agree. And many times it leads to indecision. So, but I want to ask you, with this huge vision that you have, like what you're doing can be huge, right? Is there an initiative or a decision which you have been holding on, where it's like you know what to do, but you're just not giving yourself the permission to move confidently and boldly in that direction? Maybe you're waiting for something to happen before you do that. Is there something like that?
I think that's a really good point. And I think there's a huge psychological element to these things in terms of, to go to your point earlier, people have blind spots around what they're doing, and people have different ways that they approach things. They have things which they don't do for unknown reasons. A lot of the time they have things which they do for unknown reasons. And so I think if I knew what those things were, then I would inevitably be doing them, right? And I think probably the things which hold back our work and reduce our impact are probably kind of beliefs that I have that I think are fixed, when actually they are more malleable and they can change. And I think that's a big part of doing this type of work and developing over time and building up experience over time is, I think it's this development of a more malleable kind of growth mindset, really, versus a fixed mindset. And I think being able to be in a position and say, I don't know how to get to this particular destination in the future, but being confident enough to say, but I do know that I can probably figure out how to get to that destination, because I'm not going from point A to point B immediately. I'm going from point A to point A, point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4 to get to point B. So that's how I think about it. I think with a lot of stuff as it relates to confidence, a lot of things come from doing the reps and doing the work to build up confidence over time. So I tend to think about it as, I need to develop systems and develop a structure in my life that encourages me to act as much as possible, because from acting, I get feedback on the results of that action. And then that means that I can integrate that into what I do next. So I would see that as being, I'd almost kind of reframe the question in a way to go, rather than identifying what's stopping me, it's almost, I would see it as, can you identify the things that motivate you to act? So a little bit of rather than removing the constraint, it's almost, how do you think about building momentum? And sometimes some of those constraints just fall like fall away because there's so much momentum. But I think there's two perspectives on looking at it. You can remove the thing which is holding you back, or you can
Yeah.
really boost the thing which is pushing you forward and accelerating you, and as I say, creating that momentum. And it's probably a bit of both, right? It's probably doing both of those
Yeah.
things simultaneously.
If you look at yourself and imagine like that big dream that you have has come
Mm.
true, then you're leading that, not just an organization, but also almost like a movement, something new which has come in the world because of what you have done. And if you compare yourself to who you are today, right? What part of you think that you will have to let go of or leave behind or stop doing? And what is something that maybe you will have to build, right? If you're leading that big movement, which is already omnipresent almost out there, what is it that does not exist in you that you will have to cultivate or build? And what is it that you have to leave behind, let go of?
That's a very good question. I would say the thing I would need to leave behind, I suppose, is what we were talking about just now around things like limiting beliefs that I might have that put a kind of cap on what I think is possible. And I think those come from all number of different number of areas in our lives. But I think that's something to leave behind, right? I think if you want to really go out there and impact the world in a really positive way, I think you have to be almost, you need to be like extremely optimistic that will occur, because I think it requires that level of self-belief and that it requires that level of optimism for that to happen and for that to build up. So I think that would be something to leave behind. I think one of the things which I feel has developed over my time in doing what I'm doing now, which I think almost expands my point of view and expands my kind of vision of what's possible, is getting really, really comfortable with stepping into the identity of the person that you want to be next. If you, let's say you want to, yesterday we've got a new prime minister here in the UK. They have to, if they want to step into that role, quite a long time before they actually step into that role, they have to assume that identity in a way for people to be able to take them seriously, for them to be building up the support they need, building up the votes they need, etc. And I think that's a really critical part of leadership, and particularly going after these kind of big, ambitious goals, is at some point you just need to say, I am the type of person that does that, right? So we've spoken about mountaineering, for example. There are lots of other people out there in the world that have a huge number of years more experience than I do as it relates to mountaineering. But to be able to do that and to be able to become that person, you have to step into that identity, right? You have to say, I really enjoy doing this. I go out into the mountains regularly. I'm on this journey to climb different mountains on different continents. What else am I in that area other than a mountaineer? That's what that word kind of means and what it kind of describes. I think that's been really powerful for me, and I think something which I'll need to continue to do in my life to expand that.
If you want to take this to the world out there, what is an example, like a kind of identity that you have to or step into?
Again, it's a very good question. I think it may be overused. This idea of being a leader is, it comes with an identity that requires you to act in a certain way. There is obviously all of the traditional ways that people think about leadership and leading from the front rather than leading from the back and supporting teams in that way. I think there's also things there about being able to make decisions and to be building up the muscle and building up the capability to make decisions that nobody else is going to make. That to me is a really big constituent part of leadership, is acting, basically taking time to think over things, getting kind of space to be able to consider all the different options, making sure you talk to all of the different stakeholders involved in those decisions. But ultimately, it's being the person that says, we're going to do this rather than doing this, and being confident in that vision. So I think, to answer your question, I think assuming the identity of a leader is a really important thing to do. I think it's also something which is often hard to consider about yourself, because some people might consider you a leader in some areas, but you don't consider that yourself just because you don't necessarily feel the same way. So that's definitely part of it. I think a part of where we are as a business developing at the moment, And I think something which I feel is starting to be more integrated into things which I feel really resonate with my identity is being a kind of convener as well. So bringing people together, not only to bring them together and say, this is what you should do, and playing that leadership role, but also how can you convene people to make them step into these leadership identities and to give them the confidence that they need to be able to effectively lead in their own lives. And I think that's certainly a kind of a next step development, really, is how do you go from developing yourself and ensuring you can lead people to really developing other people and developing the skills, capabilities, confidence that they need to be able to distribute that to more people. That, to me, that feels that's where a lot of the kind of the impact comes from. Yeah, I want to help people do this in their own life, as well as obviously develop my own leadership abilities to be able to do that.
Yeah. So that's what you feel is the next level of growth, or like that identity that is calling you to grow other people as leaders, but also to not shy back from the leadership yourself, right? And that convening part.
I think it's a different type of leadership as well. It's not a huge diversion from the path that I'm already on. It's about, so there are various things, like I am part of a community called the Entrepreneurs Organization. It's called EO. And a lot of that is, so it's like a voluntary run organization. People step into various governance roles within it. Now, a big part of that is about kind of leaders leading leaders is a whole different game. You know, it's a whole different skill to be able to do that. And for me, as we're saying, I think developing into that and being able to say, okay, what will get this person to their very best place as it relates to them as a leader, that's a very different thing to almost kind of leading followers. That's probably the best way to think about it. But yeah, I think that's probably the next stage for me.
Yeah. And coming back to your mountaineering, right? Can you share one example of something that happened on a mountain which was very threatening or confronting for you?
So luckily, so far, it's been okay-ish in terms of danger. I'm thinking about kind of experiences I've had recently. I think so. I was in North Wales on a mountain called Tryfan a few months ago, and there was a big group of us. There was about 40 or 50 of us going up the hill. And it was fairly physically taxing at times. And it was also quite rough ground, essentially. So there was a little bit of scrambling versus just walking. And scrambling is when you get your hands involved as well as your feet. So it's moving towards climbing. And we had a number of people in the group get injured, I'd say probably kind of halfway up around that level. And essentially the terrain was going to get worse after that. So it was going to become slightly more dangerous. It was going to become slightly harder to traverse than it would be otherwise. And there was a moment there where the group, and luckily we had a great group of leaders with us, they had to make a decision essentially to say, okay, these people who are injured, is that going to mean that everyone is going to get to the top if they continue to stay with us? Or do they need to go down to get support to enable everyone else to move forward? And I think from a leadership point of view, even as an observer in that particular scenario, it was a great thing to see because you saw multiple things going on. You saw people stepping up to support those people who were making this decision of whether to go down or whether to go up. You had the individuals themselves who were injured trying to say, okay, do I want to step into being a leader in that scenario to say, actually, I can do this and I can continue, or I'm going to go down. And it was just this really interesting decision environment. And ultimately, we decided that they were going to go down and a few people stepped up and took them down and helped them get off the mountain. But what that enabled was, to go to your point earlier about removing the constraint, there was a constraint on the whole. And those people really very graciously, like they'd come to do this particular climb and just by bad luck, they'd injured themselves, but they said, we're going to go down and everyone else can continue. And we all then continued up as a group and we were able to get to the summit of that hill. So it was a very interesting scenario, and I think shows quite a lot of different things going on. You can be a leader and decide to do something which isn't necessarily to your advantage, but is to the advantage of others. I think that's really demonstrative of
Yeah.
just, taking leadership and making a decision, basically.
Yeah. And I think one of the things with a decision like that is like there is no right and wrong decision. And yet you have to make one, even at the risk of some people being unhappy or not agreeing with your decision, right? So how has that been for you, right? When you have to make decisions, how do the people in front of you or the people who will be impacted, how do they perceive you? How do they see you? How does that shape your willingness or courage to
Mm.
make a decision or to delay it or to soften it? How does that work out for you?
I think the most important part of all of this is about being authentic to yourself, essentially, and doing what you believe is the right thing to do in any scenario. And I think a lot of the time, people can sense that, feel that, see that. They can see when you're being kind of yourself versus when you're being a kind of an image of a leader that you've learned elsewhere. So I think kind of authentic leadership is super important in those types of scenarios. I think having a good understanding of what people's perception is also a big part of this. So being cognizant of the fact that you have your perception on the world, but everyone else has their perception on the world that is informed by their experience. And if you have there's this idea of essentially, so like to be able to think not only about your own kind of cognitive processes and ability, but also to think of what's going on for someone else at that particular moment, and to be able to differentiate those two things and say, this is my point of view on the decision I'm about to make. I haven't yet made it. Before I do, I'd like to hear your point of view. And that doesn't necessarily mean that point of view will always be, it will be taken into account. It won't always necessarily be, if it's a conflicting point of view, your role as a leader is to choose which of those two things you decide to move forward with. But I think that's the most effective way really in those scenarios, is gather as much diverse information as you can about the setting you're making a decision in, but then ultimately make that decision on what you feel is the right thing to do based on the data in front of you and the intuitive data that you have through your own experiences, through having made decisions in the past, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this kind of gut instinct plus data. I think that's what you're trying to get to really with good leadership.
Yeah. And do you think you have been able to do that, to make decisions based on your authentic values or principles and not basically soften them because of how it might be perceived or how somebody might be perceiving it and might even be communicating it with you, but to staying with your direction as a leader, your vision, and then the values, which basically is the guardrails of what you do and what you don't do?
I would love to think that everything I've ever done has been the most authentic, perfectly aligned decision. I've made more mistakes than you could count. And I think you try your best. You try to do what is the right thing to do. You try to do what's most authentic to you. There are lots of things in life that can pull you off course from that. There's loads of social, cultural, psychological factors always at play, right? There's a big thing which gets spoken a lot about in this field is like status, for example. Certainly within entrepreneurialism and that kind of world, there is what makes a kind of good entrepreneur to entrepreneurs, and then there's like what makes a good entrepreneur to everyone else. And there's this idea of kind of celebrating these big things sometimes, which to other people just shouldn't necessarily be celebrated. And I think that's always a tough thing, because who's your audience? Who are you talking to? What environment are you trying to make these decisions in? You have to take into account all these different things. But yeah, I think I think being truly authentic to yourself and really being able to say, this is me, as opposed to this is these other factors, I think is like a lifelong pursuit, essentially. And I think that's a really rich part of the human experience, is trying to get closer and closer to that over time, to say, actually, this is, I think about this scenario, this is what I feel about this situation that I'm in. And yeah, it's an unending pursuit.
So one last question before we wrap that up, right? What is something about you that you find it very meaningful but probably the people that are around you would not be aware of. Think like which is an important part of who you are or what you do, but maybe the people around you.
I would say it's probably something to do with the investment I make in being able to stay level-headed in different scenarios. I feel like I do a lot of work in my personal life and in my professional life to ensure that I can manage my emotions, manage my reactions to things, whether that's focusing on developing how you're controlling your breath, for example. That's a huge part of it. There are certain things like that which I think are usually quite unseen, but they make a significant difference. So this is a really small practical thing, but it's something which has really helped me over time. And it's very small, but has had these huge, I don't know, huge kind of wins for me, really, is noticing your body and what's happening in your body at particular moments as it relates to things like your shoulders being up, like how you can change how you're standing to change how you think, basically. So it's this idea of rather than changing how you think so that you act differently, it's changing how you act so you think differently. And so dropping your shoulders, for example, so often for me has been something where I'm feeling a little bit anxious, a little bit stressed. If I just focus on my kind of physicality and I drop my shoulders, I can immediately feel myself relaxing and being able to pursue something I'm about to do. Similarly, spending a lot of time getting comfortable with how I breathe. Am I breathing deeply? Am I breathing in a shallow way? These kind of very, very small micro adjustments make a significant impact on how you're feeling at that particular time and how you can approach something which seems anxiety inducing, seems scary, seems like it's going to induce some level of fear in you. But these very, very small things that you can integrate into your life, I think, can make a big difference. And they've really helped me. I think that would be something which I probably concentrate on more, perhaps, than people I think I do. And probably also being comfortable with being uncomfortable in situations that I know are going to make me more comfortable in those situations in the future. So that's a big part of confidence, I think, is it's like feeling the fear and doing stuff anyway, stepping into that, because actually that fear is a really interesting thing to interact with. And if you can, obviously within reason, you don't want to do anything just like crazily reckless or dangerous, but we can take many more risks than we think we can. And so being comfortable with the fact that we have a response to something that's been trained over hundreds of thousands, millions of years, but not letting that prevent us from doing the thing. It's just recognizing that's a feeling and then going, I'm feeling that. Now, back to what I was doing, essentially, what's next? And keeping that in mind.
That's really fascinating, because our bodies is a majority of our communication. Right? If you have seen any research on what gets communicated, our voice and the words are probably 35%, and the majority of it is physical bodies. And many times we try to change the voice or the words without changing our body. So that's really fascinating. And it's a big part of my work with entrepreneurs as well, that if you're not open in posture, listening becomes difficult. So let's say lying on a bed or you're totally relaxing, confidence or taking the hard point becomes difficult. And sometimes to go through, let's say, a situation where things or people are complacent, you will have to have the same level of edge that you will have probably if you're running through fire. You can't slow down. If you're running through fire, you need some energy to break through or to survive a difficult thing. And probably you see this in your outdoor expeditions, right? So but thank you for sharing that's part of your mindset or your thinking as you're walking through life.
No problem. I think, as I said before, I think it's this idea of momentum. Really, you got to build up momentum, and this happens a lot I do quite a lot of boxing as a way of kind of building up my exercise, and there is a large part of that, as there is in things like dancing, where if you don't move with enough force, you actually can't do what you're supposed to do. You can't make the move that you're supposed to make. You can't punch in the way that you want to punch. You can't move your body in the way that you need to be able to, unless you're really adding in enough force so that there is a counter force that comes in at play afterwards. And I think it goes into that, the thing which, I think everyone will understand. It's like riding a bike, right? If you don't ride the bike fast enough, you will fall off the bike because you just don't have enough forward momentum.
Yeah.
I think it's important in life, business, relationships, any area of your life requires momentum. Otherwise, it starts to falter. It starts to move to
Absolutely.
a side or another.
Yeah.
But that's something which definitely drives me through my life.
Where can anybody find you, right? Anybody who's listening to this can find you or find more about your work.
So you can either find out about me and what I do, find me on LinkedIn. James Tattersfield is my name. And online, if you want to find out about a business, Polar Insight, best place is probably our website, polarinsight.com.
Thank you, James, for coming on the show and sharing not just like what you do, but also how you do it and who you are. I will include these two links to your website and your LinkedIn profile with the show notes. But as we wrap this up, I would like to wish you all the best for everything that lies ahead for you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Pleasure. That's it for this episode of Choosing Leadership. Here is what I want you to know. You are capable of so much more than you currently think that you are. And that is not because I have all the answers. That is because I have lived it. I have gone from hiding behind a comfortable tech career to building companies, coaching CEOs, and standing for impossible dreams like taking India's volleyball team to the Olympics. So if this episode hits you, if it resonated with you, share it. Tag someone who needs to hear this. Tag someone who is currently playing smaller than you know that they are capable of. And if you are a leader ready to play the biggest game of your life, if you are ready to make those 100 million jumps, then reach out and let's talk about being a guest on this show. If you want to go deeper, visit tangentpartners.com or find me on LinkedIn. Once again, remember, mediocrity is a choice and so is excellence. I'm your host, Sumit Gupta, and until the next time, keep listening, keep choosing leadership.